So here we are on day 2 of Catholicism, and we'll move today into the modern and contemporary period, but we'll sort of go back to the beginning a little bit here, just to remind ourselves that, as we'll see when we get to the Reformation, but something that we need to remember now in terms specifically of Catholicism, the defining feature of Catholic Christianity really, in a lot of ways, is the sacramental principle and the way that that's approached differently from how it's approached in the post-Reformation or Protestant Christianities. But focusing on the Catholic perspective now, it's just crucial to remember that for the Catholic Christian, there can be no separating the spiritual from the material. For the spiritual reality of the Christian truth from the material of this created earth. This is the sacramental principle established in the birth of Christ, the God-man, the combination of the two. The spiritual and the material, the temporal and the eternal are necessarily intermixed. God is available only through material mediation. That is the nature of being embodied on this earth. For the Catholic Christian, embodiment is never without a spiritual dimension on the flip side, right? The two are interconnected. And so what we see here is just, some basic representations of the sacramental principle. And on the left, you see the 7 sacraments as defined by the Catholic Church since the Council of Trent. And you begin with baptism. But then what I'd like to highlight about this, informational poster, this is sort of a Catholic poster you can find online, is that you actually have 6 circles, right? It says the 7 sacraments, but there's only 6 circles. And you go from bottom to top in order of time as they happen in the life of a Catholic Christian. Baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, anointing of the sick go up from the bottom to the top, up the cross-shaped figure. Now the Eucharist would happen generally before confirmation, but it goes in the center because it's understood to be the central sacrament, right? And then on the left and the right of the arms of the cross, there's holy orders and holy matrimony, because one generally does one or the other. In very rare instances, you could live a life in which both happened, but like a widower, for instance, or a widow could then take holy orders under some circumstances, but generally it is holy orders or holy matrimony within the Catholic worldview. But here's what I want to note is that reconciliation, otherwise known as confession or penance, it's called reconciliation officially, kind of, circles, it goes around all of the other circles other than baptism, right? Baptism for Catholic Christians generally happens in infancy, so nobody's confessing at that point, but reconciliation then happens before your first communion. It happens before your confirmation, right? Not all the time before your first communion, but it is this notion of, I think it's often misunderstood in both within and outside of the Catholic world, that there's this notion that you can sort of do whatever you want and sin, and then you just say, I'm sorry, God forgive me, say 5 Hail Marys and 10 Our Fathers, and you're good, right? And this dismissal of the need to take seriously the reality of sin, such as you understand it. And in the name reconciliation, we really have a hint at what the sacrament is, and it kind of gets to the heart of what Catholic Christianity and its more spiritualized elements aims to, which is a recognition of imperfect humanity, right? The spiritual and the material are mixed. That mixture is imperfect. The nature of the material world is that there will always be graspings after the less than perfect. Perfect is complete. That's a spiritual reality within the Catholic Christian mind frame. So the material intermixture, while glorious and divine, is also necessarily incomplete. And recognizing that one has erred or wandered or done wrong, one must reconcile to the community within and to the individuals. So thinking of it as reconciliation really helps. We could speak more about that, come to office hours. But one thing that the real reason this is here is that there are 7 sacraments within the Catholic Church today, but at the time of Augustine, early church father, this is one of the quotes that are more easily available and accessible. Symbols are powerful because they are the visible signs of invisible realities. And this kind of speaks to Augustine's much longer treatise on sacraments and the sacramental principle. During his time and in his mind, in the 4th century, the sacraments were innumerable. They were visible signs of invisible grace. So there was no aspect of the material world that was not sacramental if it was recognized and engaged as such. That remained true for, 1,000 years, right? So limiting the sacraments to 7 is a relatively recent innovation, okay? So there's different ways to approach the sacraments within, much like Torah in Judaism can be narrowly defined and more broadly defined, the sacraments within Catholicism can be narrowly defined and more broadly defined, and that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Okay, moving on. So the sacramental principle, this will come up later, means that the material and the spiritual world are forever intermixed, okay? Now remember that when Pope Leo XIII's Testem Benevolentiae, which we talked about last time from 1899, condemned Americanism by name, the American Catholic Church responded with a real cautionary stance. Catholics shied away from engagement with the American secular world in a lot of ways, which led to what has been called by scholars a half-century of cultural and intellectual hibernation in American Catholicism. That's the late 18th, early 19th century. True Americanism, remember, was a matter of national identity. False Americanism was schismatic disobedience. The error was sort of twinned. The difference between the two was ambiguous. People just kept their distance. When in 1907, Vatican Secretary of State, this guy, Mary Del Val, declared that Americanism and modernism were linked and were gaining influence. So that's 1907, and it still had some momentum going. Now, this guy, the Secretary of State, Mary Del Val, Secretary of State of the Vatican, let his zeal for the condemnation of modernism get just a little out of control when Pope Benedict XV took the papal office in 1914. He found an unopened letter from Mary Del Val to the previous pope, then by that time deceased, Pius X, in which he was himself condemned as a modernist, right? So Mary Del Val had written a letter to Pope Pius X saying, this guy, who ended up becoming, the next pope, Pope Benedict XV, this guy is a modernist, and we should condemn him totally. So now the Pope, he finds this letter, and Mary Del Val is dismissed. This is just one of those moments. There was a lot of tension at the highest level of the hierarchies, down to the sort of grassroots level. This notion of how to deal with modernism wasn't always easy, hierarchically defined though the Catholic Church was. What the movements, modernism and American, had in common was this: they both sought the freedom to engage the modern world while remaining in communion with the Catholic Church, right? They didn't want to be condemned, but they did want to engage. When they were sort of defeated in a series of papal letters and condemnations and things we talked about last time, the desire to engage just found another arena. They said, fine, we won't talk theology. Doctrinal disputes subsided, like how to approach source text criticism, how to approach modern innovations in archaeology and science, and how to approach new social movements like industrialism and the urbanization that followed, and how to approach the role of the individual and community within. Doctrinal debates subsided, right? They just tabled them. They said, let's just forget about that for now. And Catholic progressives, people who did want to engage in a modernist or Americanist way, put their energy into social programs and service activities. So was born the movement that came to be known as Catholic Action, based on what came to be known as Catholic social teaching. Now here we have the modern version. This is a contemporary version. There are 7 clear steps. You can go through and look at them and read them and see they're figured pretty beautifully in a lot of artwork throughout the Catholic world, this Catholic social teaching model. But the original planks in its platform when it began, based on another letter, Rerum Novarum, written by Leo XIII in 1891, right? So all of these things historically were intermixed. The planks in this platform there were 3, right? So now there's 7, and they've kind of spun out a little bit from these original 3, which is the right to private property, and that was kind of a response to communism and also feudalism, any kind of wage slavery, right? The individual has the right to private property. You have the right to work for something, own it, and feed your family with it, right? But also the ultimate destination of all material, right? So this notion that, here's the second plank, right? That all the private property you have, including your own body, everything's going to dust, right? So there's this sense of futurity sort of written into the Catholic social teaching, an eschatological sense, which means the last things. Eschatology is like death, judgment, heaven, and hell for the Christians, right? So it's like you want to think about the fact that everything's dust, and you're going to go to, within the Christian frame, a divine sense of judgment, right? So that should govern your relationship with private property, and including your own body. And private property would be governed by the common good, right? So those are the three planks. And the common good, the notion of this was that, like, if I had, you can sort of think about Les Mis, those of you who are familiar with that book or play. That if I have a pantry full of bread and more than I need to survive, and for my family to survive, but my neighbor is starving, then it's not my bread anymore. My private property, the right to private property, is completely gone the second I have more than I need and my neighbor has less than they need, right? So we have the right to private property within this frame, but it's governed by the common good. So this is where it spins out into rights and responsibilities, the option for the poor and vulnerable, right? Family, community, and participation in the larger community, solidarity, right? All of these, they kind of tease it out into a much more complex vision, but the basic notion it began from was private property is cool only to the degree to which it doesn't impinge upon the ability, through kind of hoarding, the ability of others to live, right? So Leo the 13th quoted Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, the father of the church, for whom also, by the way, the sacraments were innumerable. Anything that was considered sacred would be approached as sacred would be considered a sacrament for Aquinas. But anyway, Leo quoted Aquinas on this, saying, "Man should not consider his material possessions as his own, but as common to all, so as to share them without hesitation when others are in need." That's an assertion, a firm assertion, but the first assertion is the right to private property, right? You do have the right, but it's not really yours. It's all going to dust, and your neighbors need help, right? So actual engagement was approved more easily if doctrinal debates were tabled, right? So people were allowed to engage the modern world more easily and without condemnation from the church if they just didn't talk too much about doctrinal issues. And we'll see this today later with Francis. So here's kind of, now we'll go track through history a little bit. Here's 1924 was the introduction of this magazine, The Commonweal, which, as you can see, very much still exists today. It was a journal dedicated to Catholics taking up the call to take some responsibility for the future direction of the nation. So this is a specifically like American Catholic magazine, politically oriented. And it asks the question constantly, how to maintain a sort of true Catholicism in communion with the Pope in Rome, and yet engage social issues. So you can see that they have continued to do this. These are just some recent covers for the Commonweal magazine. In 1931, Pope Pius XI put out an encyclical emphasizing, quote, the social character of ownership. So, in the early days of what we might call a proto-consumer capitalism, the Pope was very much, the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, the official doctrine was very much engaging questions of what does private property look like in a capitalist world, right? That's engaging with the modern world. And seeking to balance the, quote, also in the same encyclical, sought to balance the, quote, sordid love of wealth, sordid as in like despicable, kind of low, love of wealth, which is the shame and great sin of our age, with the laws of Christian moderation. So they're trying to figure out how to apply Catholic social teaching or traditional Catholic doctrine to the economic realities of the modern post-industrial period. And Catholic organizations sprouted up in every arena of American secular life. Here's a few. There was the Catholic Rural Life Conference, which was established in 1923 and continues today. Catholic Youth Organization, established in 1930, continues today. Many of you may have played basketball. They do a lot of that, sports. The Catholic Worker Movement was established in 1933 and led by Dorothy Day, whom we read, who really tied social action in with Catholic faith and introduced houses of hospitality, which were, places for folks without homes, for houseless people to come to work, to have dignity in their labor, and to have a roof over their head. They're called houses of hospitality, not notably homeless shelters. And people who came were treated as guests. There are still hundreds of them in America today. So the Catholic Worker Movement remains pretty influential. Also the Association of Catholic Trade Unionists, so getting in on the workers' revolts of the era, that was established in 1937. The church was not just an otherworldly organization dedicated to souls, but a this-worldly organization dedicated to bodies. That's what all these movements seem to say, right? Then, moving ahead, 1961, Mater et Magistra is sort of Mother and Teacher, right? Is published by John the 23rd, and he portrayed a church whose duties were dual because the conditions for its existence were dual. So he gets a little philosophical. He makes it on the cover of Time magazine several times. Private ownership is a natural right, but it naturally entails a social obligation as well. Is kind of a very simple, it gets very complex, and it's pretty long, this encyclical. Really, again, trying to apply Catholic social teaching to the modern economic world and figure out how to live responsibly within that. John the 23rd also called the Second Council of the Vatican, Vatican II, which opening ceremonies took place on October 11th, 1962. And this is a big deal when the Catholic Church has an ecumenical council. They sort of call everyone from around the world. This one they also called faith leaders from various traditions, not just Catholicism. So there were Protestants, there were Jews, not a super wide variety, but lots of press was present. It was followed. It was the biggest news item. That and Vietnam. That's what was covered in the early 60s. That, for Americans, those were the biggest news items. Now, John the 23rd died shortly after this council was called, and Paul VI took over in 1963. What this council did is it renewed liturgical rites, roles and responsibility of the laity, or the people in the pews, were reimagined. So all of a sudden the Mass went vernacular, right? So that was a big deal. As we talked about last time, there was it had been a Latin Mass, and this is the council that determined a vernacular Mass. And also, if you've ever attended a Catholic Mass, you know that there's a responsory element, like the priest says something, the people in the pews say something, the priest says something, the people in the pews say something. So that part of the liturgical or scripted aspect of worship was made a huge change. It was an enormous sea change to engage the people in the pews in the worship. It was also the first ecumenical council in Catholic history not to close with a series of condemnations. Every preceding council had closed with an anathema be so-and-so, an anathema be so-and-so, and like a list of condemnations saying these people were anathema, which means that you're like, they're bad, they're outside of the church, they're excommunicated, and you're kind of not allowed to talk to them because they may be contagious, right? Their thoughts may be contagious. So this is the first one that just didn't close with that. It was a much more open stance to the world. And what happened was dismay swept through the Catholic Church. A lot of people had a really hard time with it. Mass attendance peaked in 1958 in America and has declined since, as has the number of clergy, of women religious, of parochial schools, and of Catholic colleges. So we can see here on the left that it tracks Protestants, which is an internally diverse bunch, as we will see, and Catholics. While Protestants have had a modest increase in church attendance, Catholics have declined from 75 to 45, right? Percentage saying that they attend Mass regularly. That's a huge dip. And also the one on the right shows that while Catholics, the sheer number of Catholics has increased, which makes sense with population growth and also immigration, the number of priests has declined. So there's this, the 50s were a decade of growth for the Catholic Church. The 60s was a decade of decline. And some blame Vatican II, some blame the modern period, definitely Vatican II participated in a much larger shift toward modern secular engagement, which also included a decline in traditional religious practice. The hierarchy here was not, and is not, and this is maybe some reasonable people might disagree, but I will say that the hierarchy was not and is not prepared to address its own doctrinal limitations, and that's one of the driving forces behind the decline in participation. 1910's Oath Against Modernism, which you recall from last time, really hasn't been openly and directly reimagined, But it was, and it has been prepared to encourage engagement with the secular world. So, like, trying, and the Vatican II's Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, which is kind of its definitely most popular, one of the biggest documents that came out of this event, opens with these lines. It's called Gaudium et Spes, which is Latin. Generally, encyclicals are named by the Latin words that begin it. So the joys and the hopes, joy and hope. In the Latin, but it was put out in 1965, and this is the line that it opens with, okay? The joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, and of course they meant women too, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the followers of Christ, by which they mean Catholics. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. Now, what this does is open the Catholic consciousness to care about people who aren't Catholic. This notion of the one true church, beyond which or outside of which there would be no redemption, is countered here really strongly. Like, you're not, as a Catholic, no longer just sort of called doctrinally to address the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of Catholics, to worry about the well-being of Catholics, but you're actually called in the modern period to care about and act in the interest of the well-being of anyone, regardless of faith position, especially the poor and the afflicted. So it's a real opening of the pastoral sense of engagement. Regardless of faith, all people are united by their common participation in creation. And that was a big move for Catholic doctrine, right? Interdependence is part of the globalized world and part of modern media. This is what they're recognizing. And so the church went out of its way, to start doctrinally engaging what was not necessarily a Catholic world. The church condemned what it called super development or consumerism. And we see this with Pope Francis, right? Who's now we're shifting into the present moment. This is on the cover of the Rolling Stone, which is pretty neato. Francis has said, global capitalism is a system with no ethics, where the center is an idol, and the world has idolized the god, money. Right? This isn't an entirely new stance. Vatican II made much the same critique. John Paul II wrote at length about the structural sins of capitalism. But Francis is the first pope from the Americas. He's the first pope from the Southern Hemisphere. He's canonizing saints like it's his job, and really shifting the nature of sainthood in that, like really canonizing a lot of saints from the South, from the Southern Hemisphere, which was neglected historically by the Catholic Church. And he's following on work done by mid-20th century Latino Catholic activists like Cesar Chavez and Luis Fontanez, who is not pictured here. Some might say it's an exaggeration, but I would argue, or at least strongly suggest, that without Cesar Chavez, without Luis Fontanez, there'd be no Pope Francis, right? That these folks and the movements that they established really, pushed the world to recognize the role of Hispanic Catholics in determining the role of the church in the modern world, and determining doctrine, and determining the responsibility of individuals, right? The brief excerpts that you read participated in and helped to build on an Hispanic Catholic liberation theology, within which the current pope was himself schooled, right? Francis was himself schooled in this tradition in Argentina. Fontanez focuses on structural sin, as you read, on the institutions that support and perpetuate injustice. And structural sin has been an important concept for Catholic liberation theologians for two reasons. First, it points to the ways in which injustice is depersonalized in a consumer capitalist world, right? The industrial and technological bureaucracies seem to make injustice sort of not me, right? Not my problem. It's easy enough to say in this context, oh, those people suffering over there, that's not my doing. That's not my fault. I just work here. I just shop at this store. I'm just trying to get by and feed my family. The system is the problem, right? I'm not guilty. Structures of sin allow the individual to dismiss their personal responsibility to combat injustice and to participate in only just systems, right? And we all know this. This has become sort of structural violence is the secular corollary, in some ways developing out of the argument against structural sin within the Catholic world. Structures and institutions, quote, where sin originates and flourishes, according to Fontanez, must on religious grounds be changed. on religious grounds, right? The socioeconomic sphere is not irrelevant to religious life, and this isn't some newfangled theory. Liberation theologians, Fontenay and others, drew directly from the basic principles of Catholic doctrine. Remember how we started this. The sacramental principle means that for the Catholic Christian, there can be no separating the material of this earth from the spiritual realities of faith. There can be no retreat from, no surrender to the difficult questions posed by modern socioeconomic forms. Fontenay argues that faith, Catholic faith, requires social action. That being religious means you can't ignore the sort of secular, mundane realities of the economic arena. It requires that the faithful work to establish just systems of labor and economic distribution, health and education. And Cesar Chavez, in the excerpt we read, takes the concept of structural sin one step further and uses it as a mirror to reflect the problems of the church itself. Right? Why, he asks. Why, when we, speaking through his voice, why, when we, a whole lot of Hispanic Catholics, are working for justice in the way that Fontenay advocates and on sacramental principles held sacred and foundational by the Catholic Church, why is the Church itself not beside us? Right? Why is it that the very institution through which our faith has been learned, through which it has grown and developed, why is that institution absent? Why is it that Protestant pastors are the ones helping the people who are fighting for justice on the grounds of Catholic faith? It's a scathing critique. Why is the church itself so wrapped up in its own structural sin? Trenchant critique, scathing, and it's one that's relevant as well in other issues. We'll close with some brief attention to sex and sexual politics, which has been cataclysmic for Catholicism in a few ways. So remember the oath against modernism and the sentiment it portrayed. Steer clear of modern innovations, right? Modern modes of thought, those are dangerous. Pope Francis, again, says the church will fall like a house of cards if it fails to balance rules on abortion and homosexuality with the greater need to be merciful. And Francis has brought change to the church. In February 2021, he appointed the first woman undersecretary with the right to vote in the Synod of Bishops, right? So never before in the history of Catholicism has a woman been allowed to vote in the Synod of Bishops. That's huge. This is she's French, Sister Nathalie Becard. This nearly 2,000-year-old institution changes very slowly, right? But birth control, the failure of heteronormativity to reflect human experience, the difficult reality of abortion for a great many people, these issues are pressing change within the church, slowly. When Paul VI put out this another encyclical or official letter, Humanae Vitae, which means on human life, in 1968, he really drawing a line in the sand, especially regarding birth control. And here we have a quote for a man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman and, disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as his partner whom he should surround with care and affection. And while there's a great deal in this encyclical that modern, liberalizing, feminist even movements can adopt and reflect and, engage authentically, the greatest critique here, there's two sort of, one ideological critique and one very pragmatic critique. So the ideological critique I'll start with is that this, people wanted to say, hey, Pope Paul, you might be right in some ways, but this entire letter, and this quote in particular, speaks from the perspective of men, right? That you're so far afield from the experience of women that it's difficult to take you seriously in reflecting on the needs of women, right? So while we definitely don't want to encourage the objectification of any body for sexual purposes, the notion that any kind of contraceptive might just inherently do that is really, that's a heteronormative male perspective, Pope Paul VI. That's an ideological critique. We could go further with that. The more pragmatic critique is population explosion is real. Sexually transmitted diseases are real, and contraceptive methods tends to really help both. And not in just a global sort of statistical way, but also in the individual lived experience of women in this world primarily, right? That being able to determine whether or not you would like to reproduce had an enormous effect on women's ability to, especially in the so-called first world nations, engage in professional accomplishments and really work towards something, have enough time in their life, because it's difficult to dedicate yourself to a professional calling if you're cycling through pregnancy and birth and pregnancy and birth and pregnancy and birth. It's a little distracting, and while it is a wonderful calling, children, pregnancy, birth, reproduction, all that, it might not be the only calling for women, is the response. So when he put this out, it was probably coming from a good place, but it's difficult for me to take it seriously. I have daughters. I happen to be a woman in this world. But anyway, when he put this out, it was ignored. It was ignored. Its rules were just completely ignored by the vast majority of, especially, now we're focusing on America, especially American Catholics. So here's some stats. These are more modern. These are more recent. And the ones on the left, they come from an organization out of D.C. called Catholics for Choice, which I recommend you look into. We had a former president, John O'Brien of Catholics for Choice, come and speak at HSU some years back. It was pretty delightful. It's an interesting organization. They do a lot of good work, and on across ideological lines, which makes them interesting. But when it was put out in 1968, right around 80% of American Catholic priests admitted in polls that they did not counsel their parishioners to take it seriously. They said, "Listen, I have to be honest. When I'm talking to the people in my parish, I don't tell them that they need to avoid birth control. I mean, I'm looking at real lives here, right?" So you can see that 67% of Americans disagree with the Vatican's ban on birth control. Another 16% aren't sure. So and then on the bottom, do you think it's common or uncommon for Catholics nowadays to use birth control? So this is Catholics being asked, right? And 84% of Catholics believe that it's common for Catholics to use birth control. So regardless of what else is going on, only 5% of Catholics think that Catholics don't use birth control, right? So it's a good public opinion poll. And then this is the one on the right is a Pew study, a more generally responsive study that's 2012 and 2014. So it's not super new, but it hasn't changed that much. And it regards divorce and birth control. And so you see when it comes to divorce that, 32% find it morally acceptable, but 45% think it's not a moral issue, right? So this is Catholics saying, look, divorce and your whole ban on divorce, really not a moral issue. Like, you're just out of your depth, you're playing in the wrong field here, is kind of their opinion. 19% agree with the Catholic stance, and 17% agree with the Catholic stance on birth control, but 77 don't. So overwhelmingly, Humana Vitae and all of its, that was disregarded. Clearly that doctrine is not reflective of Catholic reality or the lived experience of Catholics, right? And it's just being changed by practice, right? Now, homosexuality is a more difficult topic for some Catholics, but even by the Pope is being approached in new and more inclusive ways. And to be clear, there has been no change to doctrine here. The Pope has not changed doctrine. He has only changed mood. He has said things that suggest that judgment, condemnation, damnation, exclusion from the church is not a very Christian attitude, but he has not changed doctrine, and it might, seeing as how he's one individual within a very large and powerful hierarchy, it might not be possible for him to do that, but he is shifting the needle anyway. But polls show consistently that younger American Catholics are moving the needle on this, right? And so you have Western Europe and America. The U.S. is in the middle, in the darker color, right? So it's the percentage of Catholics in each country who favor or oppose allowing gays and lesbians to marry legally. 61% of Catholics in America favor same-sex marriage, right? They favor it, right? They say that's cool. So the majority of American Catholics think that same-sex marriage, there's just no, why are we talking about it, right? And then they do it sort of by age group, and that shows the degree to which the younger generations really are shifting the needle. That 85% of the 18 to 29 cohort and 75 on the bottom of the 18 to 29 cohort are really are really pushing it, but you're still dealing with a majority of all Catholics, 70% and 57%. You're still dealing with a clear majority on this issue. So again, this is a doctrine that is behind the times. And in terms of abortion, well, change is even slower. Forgiveness, mercy, those stances may be adopted. But over half of U.S. Catholics say it should be legal, right? But the Catholic, and so you can pause and look at this, they are split by political party more than by religious affiliation, right? So Americans are in terms of abortion questions. Also, global warming fits up in there in the pew on the left, but we're not talking about that so much. But the Catholic stance on life remains, like the hierarchical stance, remains pretty immutable. The Catholic Church is as forcefully opposed to abortion as it is to the death penalty, and on the same logic. But as you see here, American polling shows Catholics divided about on about the same numbers as the larger population. So that, I think, also is, in terms of Catholic doctrine, not clearly stable. Like, how long will change happens hierarchically after the population already has made the change? That what tends to happen is the hierarchy goes back and creates a doctrine to reflect that. The Catholic Church is not liberal, right? It's not an innovating body. It is a conservative body. It conserves tradition. It holds to tradition in a way that we'll see the Reformation churches are not as attached to, right? Catholics very much weigh tradition in all things and believe that the past can tell us about the present, which on its face is like not a bad stance. Can the past tell us about the present? I think it can, right? Can it teach us things about the present? Yeah, I believe in history, right? But that tends in more conservative movements to mean don't change, right? A resistance to change, which again is like, be careful when you change, is kind of the conservative mentality. Anyway, finally, and we'll close here, there is the sex abuse scandal that has absolutely rocked the church in recent decades. It has been the top concern for the majority of Catholics, right? You can see in the middle slide, Catholics' priorities for the new pope. This is right as Francis was coming in as pope, was addressing the abuse scandal. 70% of Catholics say that's the top of the list for me. And you'll see from the Gallup poll on the right that the sexual abuse of especially young people by priests led a lot of people to reconsider their affiliation with Catholicism, and probably led a lot of people to leave the church. This poll doesn't say ask whether or not they did leave, it just asks whether or not they thought about it, and a lot of folks did, right? And more so in between the years when the sex scandal broke. Anyone who would like to watch the film Spotlight on the left and write 2 paragraphs on it and on its place in the curriculum of this class will get 2 points of extra credit. Send me your write-up via email. And that, it's a pretty remarkable film that kind of details how it is that the sex scandal was broken as a news story in Boston. I recommend it to you. So the church has lost a lot of faith, trust, affiliation, and money over its refusal to answer to the unending trauma of clergy sex abuse. This will continue to affect the role of the church in America, likely for years, maybe for decades to come. And the likelihood that there will be any reconciliation, going back to that concept from the beginning, without a direct confrontation of the issue, without a real open reconciliation on the part of the Catholic hierarchy itself, on the part of the institution itself, to recognize the real structural sins that were committed in knowingly moving one sex abuser, pedophilia sex abuser to, from one congregation to another to try to hide the abuses. Until the Catholic Church can sort of openly reconcile that, it's likely that it will continue to fester as a sort of moral injury within the Catholic Church. So next time we turn to the post-Reformation or Protestant faiths in America, which were themselves born of an attempt, a desire to reform the Christian faith embodied in the West at the time in the Catholic Church, right? And which themselves have defined the increasingly complex and often internally contradictory mainstream of American religion.